The Last of Us Part 2 is almost a year old. It will be a year old in June. I can't remember the exact date it came out, like June 6th or something like that. But I think it's safe to say that like The Last of Us Part 2 has become like one of the worst games of all time. Like I saw a really funny image like the other day of like comparing like the Metacritic scores of like E.T. versus like The Last of Us Part 2, and The Last of Us Part 2 actually does have a lower Metacritic score than E.T., the extraterrestrial, the worst game of all time. And I think that's a really fitting, reasonable thing to say because, like, in spite of like all of ET's problems, right? Like, as being as rushed as it was, it's like being rushed to market, like destroying like Atari and like the entire video game industry. In spite of all that, like The Last of Us Part 2 is something worse. It is subversive communist propaganda. Like it is downright disgusting what they've done with this series and characters. Even if you're like me and thought they were boring and lame to begin with, like this plot was the story they came up with, or Neil Druckmann came up with, was embarrassingly bad. And of course, like the gameplay was never good to begin with, and you have like all these other problems. But like even the fans who were deluded into thinking that like The Last of Us was like one of the best games ever made turned on The Last of Us Part 2. Like nothing about The Last of Us Part 2 really resonated with anyone. Like other than Neil Druckmann, who only gets showered with as much praise and attention as he gets due to his connections and nepotism in the industry. Like the actual gaming audience, people who actually like to play and enjoy games, basically everyone is in complete agreement that The Last of Us Part 2 was a complete disaster. And typically PlayStation fanboys tried to cope by saying that like Ghost of Tsushima was good. It wasn't. Or like trying to say the PS5 was going to be better. It isn't. But like I think you just don't. I think most people don't understand like what this means, right? Like The Last of Us Part 2 failing as hard as it did has not only destroyed the Last of Us IP, it has destroyed Naughty Dog as a studio and PlayStation as a viable platform in the new decade. Like this one release, I think, is going to go down as being the game that's referred to as being the moment that a lot of people, straight white men in particular, a lot of gamers will see as like the beginning of the decline of PlayStation. Now, like those of us who are informed, like me, have known that like PlayStation has been going downhill since the beginning, right? Like they've been like on a perpetual downward spiral since the PS1, and they started losing control of like all these third-party developers and like having to compete with like Microsoft, a company that's just as big as they are, which made their typical tactic of like paying for third-party exclusives like not very viable anymore. Like PlayStation has been like on a downward spiral since Xbox entered the scene, basically. What we're seeing now, I think, is just like the end result of that, in which like Nintendo is dominating the industry. Xbox is preventing PlayStation from simply buying the third-party developers, and PlayStation just has no relevancy anymore. And the game journalists, the corrupt gaming press, can pretend all they want like PlayStation is more popular than ever, but in reality, nobody wants to play games like The Last of Us Part 2.